There isn't one single book that's been ever written about Charles Manson that doesn't follow the same old thing of Helter Skelter. They start from Helter Skelter and then they build on Helter Skelter. What the Helter Skelter was? Helter Skelter was a complete conspiracy theory. Why do that? It makes no sense to do that at all. I wouldn't do that. I would start from the beginning and find out what happened. Where was Manson? What was he doing? How did all this stuff build up into what it became, this big old Helter Skelter thing? Because I don't believe it. I don't believe it one bit. I never will. And then we ask about, you know, we look at books and then I hear opinions of books. Here's my opinion of books. Books, all of them are conspiracy theories. Every single one that deals with Manson's conspiracy theory, because they all go off that stupid Helter Skelter theory, that motive. All of them, they build on that. They cut out what they don't like, they put in what they do. I don't like none of it. And people will talk about that new book, Chaos. What I like about that book, people say, is I like when they talk about the first part, but when they get to the CIA part, I don't really like that too much. Well, you know what? I don't like the other bullshit in the front of it. I like the CIA part because I think that this dude's really the only dude that's on to anything here. And that's what this is about. This is about Manson going down to the border to get himself some psychedelic mushrooms. Psychedelic mushrooms, beatniks. Beatniks like psychedelics. They like marijuana, they like psychedelics, and Manson always said he was a beatnik. What is a beatnik even?
No existe un momento del día que pueda apartarte de mí.
I just was released from McNeil Island, and I was in Mexico City prison before that. And I was in Terminal Island before that, so I really wasn't up on the 60s as much as you all make me out to be.
Now you said you also spent time in Mexico in a prison?
Yeah, I was in Mexico before.
In prison down there?
Mexico City prison, yeah, immigration prison.
What was that? Oh, what was that for?
I had been accused of killing some French people and a couple of dudes in Acapulco.
And how long were you in prison down there?
I was there a couple different times.
A couple times?
In the United States, the FBI was the organization that spied on people. Because in 1947, Truman says, no, the CIA can't spy on people. It was for international affairs. They spied on those people. Well, 1947, probably because Truman didn't want them spying on him. Well, then it comes to the 1960s, and now they're spying on everybody. And that's where his book name came from. It came from this operation that the CIA had going called Operation Chaos, where they were out basically spying on the peace movement and all these hippies now. First off, where do the hippies come from? You know? That there is a huge whole conspiracy going on here that he didn't even get a tiny bit into in his book. So let's just move it on a little bit further and talk a little bit more about these things that baffle my mind about this whole Helter Skelter nonsense. That conspiracy theory that America believed. Hook, line, and sinker. If you ever watched Manson say anything, a lot of times he comes out and says, I wasn't a hippie, I was a beatnik. I wasn't a hippie, I was a beatnik. Nobody just pass it by because they don't even care. I care. What is a beatnik? You know, when I look it up, a beatnik to me and a hippie, what's the difference between the two? That's what I really want to know. What's the difference between the two? And when you look it up, you find that maybe the beatniks didn't like the government really at all. Even the acknowledgement of the government's existence was your cooperation in helping them entrench their power and their claws. It was the changing of the psychedelics that they were finding down in Mexico, and it said that it was now taking over the kids' minds, to the shit that they created and they brought to San Francisco, and they unleashed the kids to take over their minds. Because these things didn't happen very far apart. They were pretty close together. You know, from 1957, when this article came out in Life magazine that says kids are running down, which meant the beatniks at the time were running down to Mexico to these Indian villages. looking for mushrooms to get high on the psychedelic visions and this sort of shit that's taken over their minds now. Sounds sort of like the same kind of crap that happens right up the road in 1960, doesn't it? And Manson's involved in them both. And it seems like they just let him go down in Mexico when you listen to the whole real story of it. But what really was a beatnik? A beatnik pretty much hated the government. And then, what was a beatnik?
I'll put it to you this way. When I was a little kid in the streets, I was smoking grass. And there wasn't but a few people smoking grass. I come to jail as a beatnik. I don't know whether you remember beatniks. But what your hippies were of the 60s were what we were of the 50s. Well, we got ate up by the system. And then when I got back out, the hippie was a takeoff on the beatnik, as the beatnik was a takeoff on the bohemian, or the bohemian was a takeoff on the bubskaboot. In other words, just loop-de-loops and circles that come in and out of these places.
We only have a tiny little record of what Manson was doing in 1960 in Mexico from a little newspaper article that comes out of Texas. And probably 6-month period Manson was down there. He even talks about people getting killed. He even talks about being accused, as you heard from the very beginning. He said it in a parole hearing, and nobody seemed to care. Nobody seemed to listen. They were always asking, hey, Manson, who else did you kill? And when he does tell you, you just gloss it over like nothing ever happened, but he mentions it. And then he also mentions along the way about a highway patrol guy, and this guy's daughter, and all sorts of things that nobody ever listened to. Well, let's put them all in order now and figure out what happened in Mexico looking for mushrooms. I headed south and ended up in Mexico City. When in Mexico City, I had some dollars in my pocket, so I partied and mingled with the bullfighters. I met a couple lesser known matadors and spent a few days learning to use the cape and the sword. Of course, the bulls were only half grown and the sword was never thrust into the animal, but half grown, those suckers weigh 400 to 500 pounds and could send them guy flying. My ass up off the ground a few times, I learned how to handle the cape and could stay close to the bull without getting touched as some of the matadors. You good gringo, they told me. You got the moves, but you never be a matador. You're not tall enough. I earned some respect for that group of people by being so ignorant I didn't know where to stop. I'd stolen a .357 Magnum from one of the haciendas I had visited. With some jailhouse Spanish and the kind of hand signals I seen the scouts use in the movies, I walked into a Yaqui camp like I belonged there. I stole that from Pasadena in the 50s and took it to Mexico and scared everybody to death down there with something they'd never seen before. They seen that .357 Magnum, they thought I was from outer space. Can you imagine that? A .357 Magnum coming into a field of 45s and 38s. Intending to trade the Magnum for mushrooms, I pulled the gun from my pants. Pointing it at the guy who was talking, I said, "This buy mushrooms?" The gun looked threatening, but that wasn't the way I meant it to be. So I handed the gun to one who said he'd give me some mushrooms. As soon as the gun was in his hands, he pointed it at me and said, "You loco, now I kill." He stuck the gun in my stomach and pulled the trigger. When he snapped that, there weren't any shells in it. The four of them started laughing. When my money started running out, some of the things in the homes I was invited to also started disappearing. No one called the federales, but invitations stopped coming my way. A hustler and a thief manages to find his own kind wherever he goes, and Mexico City has some areas that would make events on Miami Vice look like choir practice. I ran into some game, chilly dudes down there. If you're a highway patrol
sexual and you're molesting people on the way to school, one of the parents is going to get upset when their little girls come back with blood all over their dresses. That's what I learned in Mexico. In Mexico, if you're transgressed against another man's family and he comes and takes your life, they don't take him to trial. They give him an apology for the behavior of an asshole that didn't abide by the rules and regulations that he should have abided by. Then if you come up and you won't snitch, the Mexican cops will beat your motherfucking ass and make you tell. They'll hook you up to electronics and bury you in shit if necessary. Even the federales heard about the macho gringo who was friend of the Yaqui. They told me about it after they arrested me. Oh, Senor Manson, we hear about you before. The United States sends you back to Texas. 2 weeks later, I was booked in Laredo jail.
And did you hear what Manson said about the beatnik thing? There's circles and loops that come out of these places. And then when he was asking the parole hearing, so you've been to Mexico, he kind of locked up a little bit, really. You can watch him there. He does. He kind of like, I don't really want to say much about that. And he goes on to tell him about it because he mentions it hundreds of times before, and all the times he mentions it before, everybody just glosses it over, just as well as they do in the parole hearing. You know, that parole hearing, they're like, whatever. It's Manson being Manson again. But is it Manson being Manson, or was there some kind of bigger shit going on here? Because later on, you know what happened? The same shit that was controlling people's minds down in Mexico, these Yaqui Indians that finally tied Manson up, threw him in the back of the car and gave him to the federales. And then after they gave him to the federales knew who this dude was. He was famous in the United States, and they rushed his ass back here. Why'd they do that? Why? They don't do that for nobody, you know? Things are interesting here. And then when he gets back, then he goes back into prison. And when he goes back into prison, then guess what happens? Newspaper article comes out in San Francisco. What's it say? What does it say in that newspaper article? It says this: the first time that hippies were ever mentioned, it says beatniks are rushing to San Francisco. What's Manson do when he gets out? Rushes to San Francisco. What's he do? He controls people's minds with this shit now that the government's created. It's all a big fairy tale to me, you know? But anyway, thanks for watching again. Thanks for listening. Kind of opens up your mind a little bit, doesn't it? Like you're on mushrooms yourself.